Hello, hello. Welcome back to Loki's Library. And if you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina. On Sundays, I do a thing called Books and Booze, where I review a book and mix up a cocktail. We're at the last Sunday of the month, so it's time for another religious studies book, making this week's book A History of Judaism by Martin Goodman. The accompanying cocktail is a Macabee Blood, which is 2 ounces of Manischewitz, which is a very specific Hebrew wine, which is kosher. 1 ounces of Cherry Heering, and 4 ounces of cola. I went with Pepsi, lemon wedge to garnish. I even have the lemon. I'm even going to do the garnish today. So let's do this. You know what I forgot? I forgot a spoon to start with, but you know what I have? A knife to cut the lemon with. Guess what's going to do double duty today? All right, so this book is exactly as it says, all right? It is a history of Judaism, the religion, not the Jewish people as a whole, just specifically the history of the religion of Judaism. My computer's working awfully hard. Now, there's plenty of the history of the Jewish people in there. I mean, there has to be, since without them, there would be no Judaism, right? But the primary focus is on the religion itself and how it evolved over several thousand years. And that several thousand-year time span, I mean, we're currently in year 5,786 of the Hebrew calendar, which places the start of the Hebrew calendar somewhere way back at 3,760 BCE, before Common Era. They've been around a while. This will be interesting. Usually I shake these up, but not today. Didn't say anything about it. This just said mix them together. So I'm mixing them together. So that's almost 5,800 years of history, crammed into 534 pages of rhetoric, which is a lot to take in. Like a lot. There's a lot of history going on here. I feel like I should have gone with a bigger glass. Like, there's a reason, though, that I didn't put the ice in yet. So I want to see if this is all going to fit. It is all going to fit. And I can even put an ice cube or two in there. Doesn't say anything about ice cube, but I'm putting ice cubes in just because. So a lot of history. Lemon wedge here, which kind of made it a mixed bag for me, all right? 5,800 years of history in 534 pages is a lot of information, and it was a mixed bag. So I'm going to start with the good. Goodman does highlight the key moments in Jewish history that created the core beliefs of this oldest of human faiths. I don't know that it's the absolute oldest on the planet, but it's hands down one of the oldest for which we have a continuously traced history of. Again, I know that pagans like to make all this squawk about how, we've been around since the burning times, and, well, no, you really haven't. They have been, right? Jewish people have been here since the beginning, and it's interesting because you just it gives you the scope of that history. Like, I was watching The Mummy the other day, and when Benny is trying to make up, not get killed by the mummy, and he starts speaking in Hebrew, and Imhotep is like, the language of the slaves. Well, yes, that actually would be completely accurate, historically speaking, because Hebrew was around at that time. And for those of you who are not able to keep count, yes, this all predates both Christianity and Islam. I know Christians are largely aware of that because they all know that Christ was a Jew. Islam, there's been a lot of idiots out there on social media, especially who are spouting that Muhammad came first. He did not. Spoiler alert. Well, that's delightful. That is absolutely delightful. I quite like this one. I'm not much of a wine drinker, but the Manischewitz is pretty dang good. Yeah. Nice. All right. Anyways, so those key moments absolutely include the book of Moses. Right, he have to talk about that. He talks about Josephus. Yes, Flavius Josephus, who was a Jewish historian right after Christ. All right, and he wrote several definitive works on Jewish history up through the Roman times. Now, he didn't specifically go into Christ because Christ really wasn't much of a thing for the Jewish people. Shocking, I know, but there's a reason they're Jewish, not Christians, and that's part of it. Christ was not their Messiah. I mean, there are Jews for Jesus. That's in there. He covers it. But by and large, no, he just wasn't a thing for them. That's just not their Messiah. But he covers that. He covers the differences between the early forms. So the Pharisees, he highlighted 3 different branches of the religion back then. I do like how he had his chapters broken down because he actually had the subsections in here. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the Therapeutai, which were like doctors, basically. A fourth philosophy, which kind of came after the fact, the Zealots, and then, of course, the impact of the Dead Sea Scrolls and how all of this came on. All of this is covered, and it's all very, very interesting, right? That early history was absolutely like right up my bailiwick. It was fascinating, all right? So he discusses the various diasporas and the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And while the book is wonderfully apolitical, all right, I mean, he's definitely not inserting his politics. He's just stating just the facts. You definitely get a grasp. You definitely grasp the scope of why precisely Israel was carved out as a modern nation in which the Jewish people could settle after the Holocaust. Because truly, Jerusalem is their homeland. This is where they started. This is where their temple was built, and this should not in any way, shape, or form be confused with a synagogue, all right? Those are two completely different things, all right? For those of you who are confused, synagogue is to temple as church is to Vatican. Synagogue is small, it's local, it's where people study their religion, they assemble for prayer, they gather as a community, which is what a church is, right? Temple is where it all started. It's the central place where the sacrificial rituals were performed. It's where Jewish communities would make pilgrimages for religious purposes, very much like the Vatican in Rome. The various diasporas and periods of time in which the Jewish communities were forced to relocate due to various political and other religious movements are discussed only in the manner in which they influence leaps forward in religious doctrine for the Jewish community. And through this, you gain an understanding of how different communities formed, like the Ashkenazi, the Hasidic, the Orthodox, the Mizrahi. These are all different subsects within the Jewish community, right? Which, yeah, this was an absolute blind spot for me. I had no idea. Like, I think I knew of the Reform movement. I knew Orthodox. I knew Hasidic. Ashkenazi, I, honest to God, thought it was like a blood type, like Native Americans are God, I am well aware of how racist and ignorant that makes me sound, but this is why I read, so I can learn things, right? So I can do better. But as here, oh, I'm 10% Ashkenazi Jew. Well, that's Ashkenazi is largely settled in Germany, I think was what he said. And so you learn these things, and it was fascinating to read all of this. There were large sections on how the Kabbalah developed. Kabbalistic study is very big with metaphysical communities. How they influenced and impacted European thought, and eventually how the Enlightenment movement, how the Kabbalah influenced the Enlightenment movement, and then how the Enlightenment fed back into the Jewish community at large, and how those communities were impacted by Enlightenment thought and philosophy. So everything became this kind of round circular pattern, which was fascinating. It was very interesting to read through, and it was to trace the line of a people, as the Vikings would say, back to the beginning. Fascinating. Less fascinating was the infill. Now, what do I mean by infill, right? Well, there were long sections of text that read a lot like the begats in Genesis. And I mean, literally, that's about as far as I've ever read in the Bible, because the begats are a little on the mind-numbing side if you've, ever read the Bible. And so help me God, and I know this makes me sound horrible. Every time he went into that, I kind of wondered if this was a rabbi that was in the rabbi trading cards from the Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and then I felt like a racist. So yeah, there is that. On the plus side, I did get some more books for my wish list out of it, books that are foundational Hebrew texts, not just the Tanakh, the Torah, Bible, the Pentateuch, which is, well, the Pentateuch is, I think, more of what the Catholics call it, but still. I got these things I can put on my reading list. I can go back and read them at a later date. Written by Judaic scholars on how to worship, how to keep kosher, and what it means to be Jewish. All of this was in there. The problem is the interesting parts were really, really interesting, sucked me in, and I would be fascinated. But the parts that were not so interesting, I kind of skimmed through, literally with Charlie Brown's teacher going womp, 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 her way through in the back of my head. And another part of my brain was wondering what I'd buy if I had $1 million suddenly. So it had trouble keeping my focus, and I was not at my most focused reading this book. But to be fair, I am most definitely not the target audience for this book either. The target audience would be Judaic scholars, the Jewish community at large, people who have lived in and grown up hearing stories contained herein and want to know more about XYZ, how they came to pass, and the influence that it has on modern day life. And while I am interested in XYZ, I don't have the cultural or historical or religious background to have the perspective to know why what I'm reading is so important in context of my faith. And that's kind of sad. And actually, it's sad, but it also brings to light a glaring gap in the educational system, because a book of like this written on Christianity, I would be able to follow like that, because we learned things like, the Crusades and Charlemagne and the Holy Wars, and we learned about the Great Schism and the fractures of Catholic faith into Lutheranism and Protestantism. We learned about these things in school, which also means that any publicly educated Jewish kid learned about them in school. And then he goes and he learns about the things that are in this book in synagogue. And so he's, more educated than me, literally. And that's I'm not, certainly not decrying the Jewish faith. I'm decrying the American educational system, that there's this gap in our knowledge, that a not insignificant portion of humanity is left completely untaught in public education because they weren't important. They were very important. The Jewish people were, by and large, the financiers of a lot of those wars. And I knew that from reading about the Knights Templars, right? They had massive debts with the Jewish faith, and the Catholic Church had debts to the Templars, which is why the Templars were eventually abolished, because the Catholics said, hey, those guys are bad guys, we owe them money. And, I'm kind of seeing why the Jewish people never loaned money to the church, because the church would just fucking burn them. I'm rambling a lot here, and I know it. I do feel confident that if I broke this book into smaller sections, like, for example, if I just read the section on the Maccabees in the temple, and then read a book in depth on just the Maccabees, the context would become clear and focused for me. I do feel like this is an important book for anybody wanting to learn more about Judaism. However, I would recommend smaller, more focused reading first, and then read this as a broader overview to kind of connect the dots for you, to see why each of these things, important in their own context, how they play into a greater picture. I didn't have the educational or historical background to know what I was reading half the time to get why it was important on a larger scale. Other than it's important to the Jewish community, but the Jewish community is part of the world, and so it should be important history for everybody. And I have gaps in my history now that have been wildly exposed because of this book. So that's a good thing. Again, gives me something more I need to read about and learn about, because I don't like having gaps in my knowledge. I want to learn all the things, and now I know more of what I need to learn more of. And so it was a lot of information. It was densely packed, covering 5,800 years of history in 534 pages. But now I know the gaps in my own history, or my own knowledge of history, that I need to fill. There's some pretty big gaps there. And that's it for this week. Like I said, it's not a very long one, because I don't have the knowledge base to fill in the gaps. This book tried very hard to. And if I knew more about the various communities that he was discussing, it would have been a lot more interesting to me. So I have to go back and fill in some gaps here. And that's it for this week. If you liked what you saw, if you have any recommendations on what books I should read to help fill in those gaps, please send them to me. I'm not asking you to send me the book. I can buy that on my own, but I am interested in what gaps I need to fill. So if you have any recommendations to that effect, please let me know. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.